Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today. We have a monumental topic lined up for you.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover. It feels almost like a political thriller, honestly.
It really does. But every single detail we are discussing today is drawn straight from the historical record.
Right. No fiction here.
Exactly. Today, we are taking a deep dive into the historic United Kingdom political scandal that the entire world came to know as Partygate.
Just a massive, sprawling event.
It was. And our entire discussion today is built on a comprehensive, incredibly meticulous Wikipedia article. It chronicles the events, the sprawling investigations, and the massive political fallout that spanned from 2020 all the way through 2023,
Yeah.
and even beyond.
The Wikipedia page we are using today is exceptionally detailed. I mean, it tracks how what started as just, a few office drinks spiraled into a full-blown crisis of governance.
Touching the very highest levels of the British state.
Exactly.
So that is our mission for today. We are going to unpack how these gatherings, which took place during the strictest COVID-19 lockdowns in modern history, led to a massive police investigation and ultimately contributed to the downfall of a British prime minister.
It is a wild sequence of events.
But before we jump into the timeline, I do need to make a quick but very important note for you, the listener. We are dealing with highly charged political events today.
Very charged.
Yeah, involving major figures on both the right and the left in the UK. So just to be totally clear up front, neither of us nor this show are taking any sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints or the actions of any of the political figures we will mention. We're simply here to impartially report and break down the facts exactly as they are laid out in our source material.
Because honestly, looking at this through the lens of pure facts, timelines, and organizational behavior, that is the only way to really understand the mechanics of the scandal.
I completely agree. Okay, let's unpack this. To fully grasp the impact of Partygate, we really have to put ourselves back into the mindset of the UK in 2020.
Right, because the context is everything here.
It is. The contrast between what the public was experiencing and what was happening behind closed doors is the engine of this entire story.
We need to set the scene by looking at the strict COVID-19 lockdowns that began in the UK in March 2020. The government implemented a stay-at-home order under a new statutory instrument.
And for anyone unfamiliar with the UK legal system, a statutory instrument is basically a way for the government to make secondary laws quickly.
Right, without needing to pass a full act of parliament, you bypass the long debates.
Boom, it's law.
Exactly. And this specific order legally prohibited all non-essential travel and all social gatherings.
The public was essentially told to freeze their lives.
Completely freeze.
And as the pandemic progressed into the autumn and winter, the government introduced regional tiered systems. London, where the government is based and where Downing Street is located, moved through Tier 2, then to a very strict Tier 3.
And finally to a Tier 4 stay-at-home order by December 2020.
Right.
Those tiers carried severe restrictions. I mean, socializing between households or outside of support bubbles was entirely banned.
It's a support bubble.
Yeah, a support bubble in the UK lockdown vernacular was an exclusive network allowing a single-person household to mix with one other household.
So if you didn't fit that narrow definition, you were legally required to stay apart.
Legally required. Household mixing for Christmas was severely restricted across the UK, and in London, it was canceled altogether.
Families were kept apart during one of the hardest times in modern history. People were missing weddings, missing the births of their grandchildren, and devastatingly missing the funerals of their loved ones. That level of sacrifice was legally mandated and socially enforced across the entire country.
Which is exactly what makes the disconnect at number 10 Downing Street so jarring.
Yeah.
Because while the public was facing those legally binding rules, the source material shows us that the reality inside the Prime Minister's residence and office was something entirely different.
It's hard to reconcile.
It is. Before the pandemic, there was a standing tradition in the number 10 press office known as Wine Time Fridays.
Right, which is a relatively common end-of-week social event in many pre-pandemic workplaces. You finish up your work, grab a drink with your colleagues, unwind.
Sure, but according to our sources, these Wine Time Fridays didn't stop when the stay-at-home orders were issued. They continued right through the lockdown.
Wow.
They were so entrenched in the culture of the building that they were actually scheduled into the electronic diaries of about 50 staff members.
For what, every week?
For 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. every single week.
I was reading that part of the timeline and it just stopped me in my tracks. They even bought a dedicated drinks fridge. In December 2020, delivered right to the back door of Downing Street, specifically to keep the wine chilled for these Friday gatherings.
It's unbelievable.
To put a recurring 50-person calendar invite for drinks into an official government system, while the rest of the country is under a statutory instrument banning social contact, it is just a staggering organizational detail.
What's fascinating here is the catalyst that finally broke the dam. Because rumors of these gatherings had been swirling for quite some time.
Yeah, journalists were dibbing.
They had been trying to get the story over the line for months. The Daily Mirror first reported on it in November 2021, and the government's response was to repeatedly and forcefully deny that any rules were broken.
Just flat-out denial.
Insisting from the podium that all COVID guidance was followed at all times.
Day after day on the record. But then came the breaking point. And it wasn't just another unsourced rumor in a newspaper. It was a leaked video.
The video.
In December 2021, ITV News aired a leaked video from a year earlier, December 2020. It showed Allegra Stratton, who was the Downing Street press secretary at the time, along with other staff.
Right.
They were holding a mock press conference in their newly built media briefing room.
In this mock press conference, they are practicing how to handle difficult questions from the media. An advisor plays the role of a journalist and asks Stratton about reports of a Downing Street Christmas party taking place the previous Friday.
And their reaction to that practice question is what caused the absolute firestorm. Instead of a serious answer, they start joking.
Right, they laugh.
They joke about a fictional party that was just cheese and wine, and someone explicitly jokes on camera that there was no social distancing.
They were laughing about the very rules the rest of the country was being heavily fined by the police for breaking.
Exactly. That video completely shattered the government's official line of denial.
The visual of government officials laughing about a fictional party with no social distancing. It gave the overwhelming impression that a staff party had indeed taken place on December 18th, 2020.
And that the officials involved knew they had likely broken the rules they were in charge of communicating to the public.
Right. Once that video leaked, the floodgates opened completely. The press started digging, whistleblowers started talking.
And we started getting a timeline of extraordinary gatherings. Let's walk through some of the most vivid examples from the source material, because the sheer scale of the rule breaking is hard to wrap your head around without the specifics.
The timeline covers multiple phases of the lockdown restrictions. It shows that this wasn't isolated to a single confusing week, but spanned months of changing regulations.
So let's start with May 2020. This is right in the middle of the first national lockdown.
The strictest one.
Right. The Prime Minister's principal private secretary sent an email to over 100 staff members. The email literally invited them to make the most of the lovely weather and have socially distanced drinks in the No 10 garden.
To 100 people.
And it actually ended with the phrase, "bring your own booze."
Putting an invitation like that in writing on a government email server to over 100 people during a national lockdown, it speaks volumes about the culture of impunity at that specific moment.
It really does.
Around 30 to 40 people attended that garden gathering. They were eating picnic food and drinking. The Prime Minister himself attended for about 25 minutes.
He later had to apologize in Parliament for that. He stated he implicitly thought it was a work meeting.
A work meeting with a bring-your-own-booze invite.
Yeah, the optics of a BYOB email during a strict lockdown were undeniably damaging to his credibility.
Then we move forward a bit to June 19, 2020.
Okay.
This was Boris Johnson's birthday. A surprise get-together was organized in the cabinet room. The source notes there were up to 30 people there.
Including the Prime Minister, his wife, and an interior designer who happened to be working on their Downing Street flat at the time.
Right. They had a Union Jack cake and sang happy birthday.
This specific event is burned into the public consciousness. Not merely because it happened, but because of the bizarre political defense that was offered much later when the story broke.
I am so glad you brought that up because the defense strategy was surreal.
It was bonkers. A government minister actually went on Channel 4 News to defend the Prime Minister and claimed, with a completely straight face, that he was ambushed with a cake.
Ambushed with a cake.
It instantly became an internet meme. You have to wonder about the crisis communications strategy behind deploying a phrase like that.
Right.
Beyond the dark humor of it, it showed a deep, almost stubborn reluctance by the government's defenders to accept the reality of what a gathering was under their own laws.
The absurdity of that defense highlights how difficult it became for the government to retroactively justify these events. But perhaps the most sobering event detailed in our source material occurred on April 16, 2021.
Yeah, this is the one that really underscores the massive disconnect we were talking about earlier. This was the evening before the funeral of Prince Philip.
Right.
The entire country was in a period of strict national mourning. The Queen herself would be photographed the next day, sitting completely alone in a church pew because of the COVID restrictions.
Heartbreaking images.
Indoor mixing was completely banned. And yet, inside Downing Street that very night, there were two separate leaving parties for departing staff that eventually got so rowdy they merged into one large gathering.
The vivid details provided by the sources paint a picture of an environment that had completely lost touch with the outside world. There were about 30 people present across the merged parties.
The imagery is wild. There was loud music playing. People were dancing in the basement. At one point, a staff member was actually sent out with an empty suitcase to a local co-op supermarket on the Strand.
A suitcase?
Yes, to fill it up with bottles of wine and wheel it back past the police guards at the Downing Street gates.
Unbelievable.
The party eventually spilled out into the Downing Street garden, where the guests actually broke a child's swing belonging to the Prime Minister's young son.
These were clearly not isolated incidents, not brief pauses for a coffee between meetings. What the timeline reveals is a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior.
A culture.
Exactly. The source documents mention excessive drinking on multiple occasions, extending late into the night. There was an incident where red wine was spilled all over the walls and on official stationery supplies.
And during one of the Christmas gatherings in December 2020, things got so out of hand that a panic button was accidentally triggered by the attendees.
Right, the security alarm went off.
Which brought a Downing Street custodian and a Metropolitan Police officer rushing to the room to investigate a potential security threat, only to throw open the doors and find a crowded, noisy party in full swing.
This undeniable pattern of behavior, backed by emails, calendar invites, and eyewitness accounts, is exactly what led to the formal investigation.
They couldn't ignore it anymore.
The government could no longer dismiss the reports as mere media speculation or politically motivated attacks. This brings us to the first major reckoning, the Internal Cabinet Office inquiry.
This was the famous Sue Gray report. Sue Gray was a highly respected senior civil servant who was tasked with investigating these events.
She had a reputation for being uncompromising.
And she certainly didn't hold back in her findings.
Gray interviewed over 70 individuals. She reviewed access logs, swipe card data, and hundreds of photographs. Her final report wasn't a sterile bureaucratic log of who was where and when. It was a searing, fundamental indictment of the organizational culture within Downing Street and the Cabinet Office.
She specifically called out the excessive consumption of alcohol. She stated plainly that it is not appropriate in a professional workplace at any time, let alone during a pandemic.
Right.
But for me, one of the most damning takeaways from her entire report was her finding regarding the support staff. She noted multiple examples of lack of respect and poor treatment of security and cleaning staff.
That detail about the cleaning and security staff speaks volumes about the toxic culture that had developed.
It really does.
She also explicitly noted that junior staff felt completely unable to raise concerns about the rule breaking. They were watching their bosses, the senior political and official leadership of the country, attending these events and condoning the behavior.
Setting the tone.
The leadership entirely failed to set the standard, creating an environment where speaking up felt like career suicide.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the Internal Civil Service report was only half the story.
Right.
Initially, the Metropolitan Police had declined to investigate the gatherings. They cited a general policy that they don't look at retrospective COVID breaches long after they occurred.
But as the evidence leaked out and public outrage grew, the pressure became overwhelming. The police launched their own massive criminal investigation.
This criminal probe was known as Operation Hillman.
The scale of this police investigation, reaching into the very heart of the British government, was unprecedented in modern times.
The numbers detailed in the source are staggering for a police probe into office parties. They assigned 12 full-time detectives to the case.
12?
The investigation cost the taxpayers £460,000. The detectives reviewed 345 documents, including those emails, diary entries, and electronic door logs, and they painstakingly analyzed 510 photographs to identify individuals and verify if rules were broken.
The conclusion of Operation Hillman resulted in the police issuing 126 fixed penalty notices, which were essentially legal fines for breaking the law.
Right.
They issued these to 83 different individuals working in and around government.
Let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
126 fines. Because of this police operation, 10 Downing Street effectively became the most fined address in the entire country for COVID-19 breaches.
Crucially, the fines didn't just stop at junior civil servants. They reached the very top of the government structure. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, his wife Carrie, and the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak were all issued fines by the police for attending the birthday gathering in the cabinet room.
Which made absolute history. Boris Johnson became the first British prime minister to ever be asked questions under caution by the police, and the first to be found to have broken the law while sitting in office.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how this completely unraveled Boris Johnson's premiership.
Yeah.
The police fines were the legal consequence, but the political consequence of having misled the public and the parliament was far more severe.
He had stood up at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, on the official record, and repeatedly assured members of Parliament that all guidance was followed completely in Number 10.
Those statements led to the Parliamentary Privileges Committee launching its own formal investigation. They had to determine whether the Prime Minister had committed a contempt of Parliament,
Contempt of Parliament.
which is essentially treating the legislative body with disrespect or actively lying to them. That strikes at the very core of the democratic system.
Right.
Their final report was brutal. It concluded that Johnson had deliberately and repeatedly misled Parliament.
They noted how he tried to retroactively rewrite the meaning of the COVID rules to fit his own evidence. Like trying to claim a crowded, morale-boosting gathering with alcohol was a lawful work exception under the stay-at-home orders.
The political timeline of his downfall following these revelations is relentless. He managed to survive an initial confidence vote from his own party in June 2022, though he was severely weakened politically.
The damage to his authority was terminal at that point.
Terminal.
Yeah.
In July 2022, following a subsequent wave of unrelated scandals that Partygate had severely weakened his ability to fight off, there were mass resignations from his government.
Dozens of ministers quit in a coordinated fashion. They stated they had lost faith in his leadership, which ultimately forced his resignation as prime minister.
And it didn't even end there.
No.
Nearly a year later, when he received the advanced draft findings of the Privileges Committee in June 2023, the ones definitively stating he deliberately misled Parliament, he angrily resigned as a member of Parliament altogether.
He released a scathing statement calling the committee a kangaroo court, ending his time in frontline politics.
It was a highly dramatic exit, driven in large part by the slow-burning, inescapable fuse of the lockdown parties that had been lit years earlier.
Now, to ensure absolute balance in our deep dive today, as we promised in our disclaimer at the top of the show, we need to pivot and look at how this intense microscopic scrutiny was applied across the political spectrum.
Right.
Our source material details a significant incident involving the opposition Labour Party, which the media quickly dubbed Beergate.
The scrutiny was certainly not limited to the governing Conservative Party. The environment of suspicion touched everyone. In April 2021, a video emerged showing the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, and his deputy, Angela Rayner.
They were filmed by a member of the public through the window of an office building in Durham.
They were seen having beer and a takeaway curry during a campaign stop ahead of a local election.
This event took place at a time when indoor mixing was heavily restricted, so the video immediately drew intense comparisons to Partygate in the press.
The Labour Party's official defense was that this was a legitimate work event, a necessary pause for food late in the evening during a grueling campaign day.
And therefore, it fully complied with the legal exemptions at the time.
Right. The local police force, Durham Constabulary, initially reviewed the footage and said no retrospective action was warranted.
However, following significant media coverage and intense political pressure from the governing party, Durham Constabulary reopened the investigation in May 2022.
They applied the exact same level of rigorous scrutiny to the opposition leader. They collected detailed questionnaires from all the attendees, just as the Metropolitan Police had done to the staff in London.
The stakes were incredibly high here, too. Both Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner stated publicly that they would resign from their leadership positions if they were issued fines by the police.
But in July 2022, Durham Constabulary officially concluded their investigation. They found that the gathering was reasonably necessary for work purposes, under the specific rules in place at that time.
They cleared all the attendees and did not issue any fines.
It is a critical inclusion in the source material because it demonstrates how the cultural environment of suspicion and the demand for strict adherence to the rules impacted all political leaders.
It culminated in formal police investigations across the board, regardless of party affiliation.
Exactly.
So, what does this all mean? Why are we doing a deep dive into a political scandal from a few years ago? If you are listening to this right now, you might be thinking, okay, that's wild political gossip about politicians behaving badly, but why should I care?
Right.
Well, because this is so much more than gossip. The source material presents an absolute masterclass in organizational behavior and crisis management.
It transcends the specific political context of the UK. It is a textbook case study in what happens when the structures of leadership are fragmented and chaotic.
Yeah.
Sue Gray's report highlighted that Downing Street had grown into a massive operation with hundreds of staff, but its leadership structures hadn't evolved to manage a crisis of that scale.
The lines of accountability were completely blurred. When no one is clearly in charge of enforcing the rules, a culture of exceptionalism can take root almost overnight.
It's the classic one rule for them, another rule for us mentality.
And when the public is making unimaginable sacrifices, missing funerals, staying away from dying relatives, closing their small businesses, that kind of visible hypocrisy destroys trust instantly.
This raises an important question for anyone involved in running an organization, large or small. How does your organization handle internal whistleblowers?
Great question.
We saw clearly that junior staff in Downing Street felt completely unable to speak up because their bosses were the ones breaking the rules. If your junior staff are terrified to point out obvious rule breaking, your organization is incredibly vulnerable.
It proves that culture is set entirely from the top down. You can write all the memos, draft all the HR policies, and hold all the compliance seminars you want.
Yep.
But if the leadership is filling a suitcase with wine at the local supermarket on a Friday night while the office is supposed to be locked down, that is your actual organizational culture.
And a failure to communicate and enforce high standards can paralyze an entire institution. The UK government was essentially paralyzed for months.
Unable to pass a cohesive message.
While the police investigated its own headquarters, it serves as a stark reminder that authority relies almost entirely on legitimacy.
Right.
And legitimacy requires leaders to visibly subject themselves to the exact same rules they impose on others.
Let's wrap this up. We have journeyed from the strict, isolating days of the national COVID-19 lockdowns to the surreal, leaked video of the mock press conference that broke the story wide open.
We've seen the damning findings of Sue Gray's civil service report. It exposed a toxic culture that mistreated security and cleaning staff.
We examined the unprecedented scale of Operation Hillman, resulting in 126 fines and making the heart of government the most fined address in the country.
And we followed the political dominoes falling, culminating in the resignation of a prime minister who was ultimately found to have deliberately misled Parliament.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We've talked about the parties, the organizational failures, and the politics, but consider the digital footprint of modern scandal.
The digital footprint.
Partygate wasn't just uncovered by traditional investigative shoe leather journalism.
No, it was fueled by an unavoidable permanent trail of data.
Think about what that means for a second. It was fueled by internal WhatsApp messages complaining about the press. It was documented by electronic swipe card door logs proving exactly who was in the building at 2 a.m.
It was coordinated via digital calendar invites for Wine Time Fridays.
And, incredibly, it was captured by official Downing Street photographers taking high-quality pictures of the gatherings, which were later handed directly over to the police.
Incredible.
In an era where literally every movement, every swipe, and every digital message leaves a permanent trace, is the concept of a traditional organizational cover-up completely obsolete?
A fascinating question to leave on. The evidence is always there, waiting to be found if someone is willing to look for it.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope it gave you some valuable insights to take back to your own world. Keep asking questions, and we will see you next time.